My accountant used the word insolvent. I'd never had anyone use that word about me in my life, and there I was, 62 years old, hearing it for the first time over a phone call while I was sitting on a sun lounger. I'm Barry, 62, from Essex. I want to tell you something most of these stories don't tell you, because most of these stories are about a man who got taken by one woman. One lie, one moment he can point to and say that's where it went wrong. Mine isn't that. Nobody actually scammed me, not in the way you'd report to a bank or a fraud line. I did this entirely to myself with both eyes wide open, and somehow that's harder to live with than if someone had simply robbed me. I'd worked 38 years in scaffolding, built a decent business up from nothing. Sold it 3 years before retirement age because a buyer made me an offer I'd have been a fool to refuse. Comfortable money. Properly comfortable, the kind that meant I'd never have to think hard about a bill again, the kind my dad, who'd worked himself into the ground on the docks, would have called set up for life. My wife Denise and I had been together 31 years, married for 26 of them, and I want to say plainly that the marriage didn't fail because anyone did anything terrible. It failed the way a lot of long marriages fail, slowly, through two people becoming roommates who occasionally remembered they used to be something else. I won't pretend the split itself was the trigger for what came after, not entirely, but it certainly removed the last set of eyes that might have noticed what was starting to happen to me. I went to Pattaya for the first time about 4 months after the divorce finalised on a recommendation from an old scaffolding mate who'd been going for years and never stopped going on about it. I'd never really been a big drinker, never really been the lad's holiday type even in my 20s, but something about being 60, suddenly single, suddenly sitting on more money than I knew what to do with, made the idea of 2 weeks somewhere completely different feel less like indulgence and more like something I'd actually earned. I want to describe what that first trip felt like, because I think the feeling is the actual engine of everything that followed more than any single person or any single lie. I walked into a bar on my second night, and within about 20 minutes I had 3 women sitting with me, laughing at things I said, genuinely seeming to find me interesting, asking about my life back home with what felt like real curiosity. I hadn't felt looked at like that, properly looked at, wanted in a room since I was perhaps 30 years old. Denise and I, in our last decade together, had become the kind of couple who sat in separate rooms most evenings. This was the precise opposite of that, amplified by about a factor of 10. It hit me like nothing had hit me in years. I bought drinks for the table that night without really thinking about the cost, because the cost was nothing, genuinely nothing against what I had sitting in my accounts. I tipped generously. I picked up the bill when a small group of us went for food afterward, 8 or 9 people, most of whom I'd met that same evening. Remember the specific feeling of doing that, of being the man who could simply say, "Don't worry about it, I've got this," and watching the room's reaction to that statement. I'd spent 38 years on scaffolding sites being a useful, reliable, unremarkable sort of man. For the first time in my life, I was the most interesting person in the room. And the mechanism for staying that person was painfully, dangerously simple. You just kept paying. That first 2-week trip cost me around £4,000, which felt, against what I had, like genuinely nothing at all, the kind of money I'd previously have spent on a reasonably nice kitchen renovation. I went home thinking about it constantly. I went back 6 weeks later. The second trip is where a woman called Som became a regular feature. Though I want to be careful here, because I don't think Som herself was ever the actual problem in the way Mai was for other men telling these stories. Som was genuinely warm, genuinely seemed to enjoy my company specifically rather than simply my wallet, and even now, knowing everything I know. I'm not entirely sure how much of what passed between us was calculated and how much was real on her end, because I think for her, much like for me, The lines had become genuinely blurred by money moving so constantly between us that neither of us was tracking it properly anymore. I rented an apartment for 3 months on that second trip rather than staying in a hotel because 3 months felt, at the time, like a perfectly reasonable amount of time to spend somewhere I was finally properly happy. I bought Som a motorbike in month 2, not because she'd asked directly, simply because she'd mentioned hers was old and unreliable, and I genuinely liked the idea of being a man who could simply fix that kind of problem for someone with no real effort on my part. I started paying rent on a small flat for her separately from the apartment I was renting for myself, told myself this was sensible, practical, the kind of arrangement that made sense if I was going to keep coming back. I want to be honest about the women, plural, because this wasn't a single relationship narrative the way it is for a lot of men in these stories. Over roughly 18 months I was, at various points, supporting Som and a younger woman called Nock I'd met at a different bar entirely, who I saw whenever I was in a different part of the city. And for about 4 months, a woman in Phuket I'd flown to see twice, each of them entirely unaware, as far as I'm aware, of the other's existence, each of them receiving money regularly, gifts, rent contributions, the occasional larger amount for a family situation that I genuinely never properly questioned, because questioning it felt, at the time, like the small price of admission to feeling the way all of this made me feel. I want to try to explain the feeling properly, because I think it's the actual centre of this story rather than any single transaction. For 18 months, I felt almost constantly like the best version of myself, the most generous, most wanted, most alive man I had ever been. I'd wake up in Pattaya to messages from 3 different women, each one warm, each one seemingly delighted I existed, and I'd spend my days doing essentially nothing of consequence, and my evenings being the man who picked up every bill, bought every round, fixed every small financial problem that crossed my path, and the version of myself in that loop felt genuinely like the man I should have been all along, rather than the reliable, unremarkable scaffolder who'd spent 38 years being useful and invisible in roughly equal measure. I stopped properly tracking what I was spending around month 8, not because I made a conscious decision to stop, simply because tracking it had started to feel like a buzzkill, like bringing accountancy into a part of my life that was finally, for the first time, entirely about feeling rather than calculating. I'd transfer money the way you might tip a waiter, a small automatic gesture that didn't require thought. Except these weren't small amounts and they weren't occasional. They were constant, weekly, sometimes daily, across 3 separate ongoing arrangements that each individually might have looked manageable and that collectively were eating through a sum of money that had been meant to last me the rest of my life. I flew back to England perhaps 4 times in that 18-month period, brief visits to see my 2 sons and check in on the financial side of things in the vague, avoidant way I was managing all of it by them. My elder son, Craig, said something to me on one of those visits that I brushed off entirely at the time and that I think about constantly now. He said, "Dad, you seem like you're spending money like there's a war on and we're losing it." I laughed. I told him I'd worked 38 years and I was entitled to enjoy what I'd earned. He didn't push it further, because Craig has never been a man who pushes, and I think now that not pushing was the single biggest mistake either of us made in this entire story. Though I understand completely why he didn't, because at the time I would have heard any pushing as exactly the kind of joyless interference I'd left behind with Denise. The accountant's call came on an entirely ordinary Tuesday morning. I was on a sun lounger at the apartment complex, genuinely relaxed, genuinely happy in the moment, when he rang to discuss what he called, with the careful neutrality of a man delivering very bad news as gently as professional language allows, a significant liquidity concern. I asked him to use simpler words. He used the word insolvent. He explained patiently that between the apartment rentals, the motorbike, the flat I was paying for Som, the regular transfers to Knock, the Phuket arrangement, and the general daily spending of a man living the way I'd been living for a year and a half. I had gone through, in 18 months, just over £310,000. I want to say that number again slowly, because saying it quickly the first time doesn't do justice to what it actually represents. £310,000. The entire sale of a business I'd spent 38 years building, gone in a year and a half, on rent for women who would, within weeks of the money, stop answering messages almost entirely. On motorbikes and small flats and rounds of drinks and the specific, addictive feeling of being the most important man in every room I walked into. I flew home permanently 4 days after that phone call. I told Som I needed to sort some things out back in England, and her response, warm and supportive on the surface, contained a question almost immediately about when I'd be transferring the next month's rent, which was, I think, the moment the entire 18 months finally arranged itself properly in my head into something I could actually look at clearly rather than simply feel. I want to talk about what's left, because I think that matters more than the warning itself. I have, after selling what remained of some investments and a small property I kept in Essex, enough to live modestly for perhaps the next 15 years if I'm extremely careful, which at 62 means I will almost certainly need to find some kind of work again, something I genuinely thought I'd finished with for good. My relationship with Craig is civil but changed, the easy trust between us replaced with something more careful on both sides. My younger son Liam barely speaks to me at all, which I understand completely and don't blame him for in the slightest. I don't think anyone scammed me in the way these stories usually mean it. I think I scammed myself, used 3 women who may or may not have genuinely cared about me to do it, and called the entire process living, finally properly living, right up until the exact moment a man on the phone used a word I'd never expected to hear about myself. If you're 60, recently single, sitting on money that finally feels like freedom rather than responsibility, I'd ask you this. Notice the feeling of being the most interesting man in the room. Notice it specifically and ask yourself honestly what's actually generating that feeling. If the answer is your personality, your humour, the man you've always been underneath the job title, that's worth protecting and enjoying properly. If the answer, if you're honest with yourself, is the bill you just picked up, that feeling will need feeding constantly at a rate no amount of money actually survives indefinitely, and the room will empty the moment you stop paying for it to stay full. I worked 38 years to build something. It took 18 months and my own willing hand on every single transfer to take it apart completely. I want to go back to that first night in the bar because I think I rushed past it too quickly, and the detail of it matters more than I gave it credit for at the time. There was a moment, perhaps 40 minutes in, where one of the 3 women, not Som, a different woman whose name I genuinely no longer remember, leaned over and said something to me that I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. She said, "You're funny, properly funny, not like the other men in here." I want to be honest that I have absolutely no way of knowing whether that was a calculated line delivered to 100 different men before me or a genuine observation. What I do know is that I believed it completely, and more importantly, I needed it to be true in a way that overrode any capacity I might otherwise have had to question it. Denise hadn't laughed at one of my jokes properly in at least 6 years. I'd stopped making them at home, I think somewhere around year 4 of that decline, simply because the silence that followed had become its own small punishment I'd learned to avoid. I should describe the apartment I rented for those 3 months on the second trip, because the physical space itself became part of the story in a way I didn't appreciate until much later. It was on the 11th floor, sea view, the kind of place that cost more in a month than my mortgage repayment used to cost back when Denise and I were still paying one off together. I remember standing on the balcony on my first evening there, beer in hand, looking out at the water and thinking with absolute clarity that this was the first time in perhaps a decade I had felt genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, no qualification attached to it, no, but underneath it. I want you to understand that the apartment, the balcony, the beer, the view, none of that was the problem in itself. The problem was that I'd attached the source of that happiness entirely to the three women and the spending that surrounded them rather than to anything more durable, and so maintaining the feeling required maintaining the spending indefinitely with no natural ceiling anywhere in sight. I bought the motorbike for Som on what I genuinely remember as a whim. Though looking back, I don't think anything in that period was quite as spontaneous as it felt at the time. We were walking past a dealership. She mentioned lightly, almost as an aside, that her current bike kept breaking down and cost more to fix than it was worth. I walked in within the hour and bought her a new one outright, paid in cash. And I remember the specific physical sensation of doing that, a kind of warmth spreading through my chest that I can only describe as something close to pride. The pride of a man who could simply solve a problem for someone with no effort and no real consequence to himself. I didn't notice or didn't let myself notice that the bike cost roughly what I used to earn in 2 months on the scaffolding sites in my 30s, back when 2 months of wages had felt like something substantial rather than something I could hand over on a pavement outside a dealership without a second thought. The arrangement with Knock developed somewhat differently, and I think it's worth describing because it shows how the pattern repeated itself with variations rather than identically. I met her at a bar in a different part of the city, somewhere I'd gone specifically because a mate I'd made locally, another expat, had recommended it as quieter, less obviously geared toward tourists. Knock was younger than Som, 24 I believe, studying part-time alongside whatever work she was doing in the evenings, and our relationship had a different texture to it, less overtly romantic in the early stages, more like I was a kind of benefactor figure, someone helping a bright young woman get through her studies. I paid for a laptop for her course. I paid 2 terms of fees directly to the institution, which felt at the time like the single most responsible and genuinely useful thing I'd done with my money in the entire period, the closest any of it came to feeling like it served a purpose beyond my own immediate gratification. I want to be honest that I don't know, even now, whether Knock's course was entirely real in the way she described it, whether the fees I paid went where I believed they went. I never checked. I think part of me actively avoided checking because checking would have meant introducing the kind of scrutiny that the entire 18 months depended on me not applying to anything. The Phuket arrangement was different again, shorter, more compressed, 4 months rather than the longer ongoing patterns with Som and Knock. I met a woman there during what was meant to be a brief solo trip away from Pattaya, a kind of holiday from my holiday, and within a week I'd extended my stay twice and was paying for a hotel suite considerably more expensive than anything I'd booked for myself alone. I flew back to see her on 2 further occasions over those 4 months. Each flight booked with the same impulsive ease as everything else by that point, each visit costing several £1,000s in flights, accommodation, and the now entirely automatic generosity that had become less a choice and more simply how I operated. I mentioned Craig's comment about the war and losing it, but I want to add the rest of that conversation because I cut it short before and the full exchange matters more than the single line. After he said it and after I laughed it off, he went quiet for a moment and then he asked, quite carefully, whether I was happy. Properly happy, he said, not just having a good time. I told him I was the happiest I'd been in 15 years, and I want to be clear that this wasn't a lie. Not in the moment I said it, I believed it completely. I think that's actually the hardest part of this entire story to explain to anyone who hasn't lived through something similar. The happiness was real. The 18 months weren't a performance I was putting on for myself. They were the genuine high point of feeling alive that I'd experienced since perhaps my early 30s. The tragedy isn't that I was miserable and didn't realise it. The tragedy is that I was genuinely, completely happy, built on a foundation that could only ever hold for as long as the money kept moving. I want to describe the accountant's call in a bit more detail because the immediate aftermath of it matters. After he used the word insolvent, after he walked me through the actual figures, line by line, rental agreements, transfer histories, the slow accumulating total that I had genuinely never once added up myself across the full 18 months, I sat on that sun lounger for what must have been close to an hour after the call ended, not moving, just looking at the same view that had made me feel so uncomplicatedly happy on my first evening in that apartment. I remember thinking, with a kind of detached clarity that felt almost like watching myself from outside my own body, that the view hadn't changed at all. The water looked exactly the same. I had simply run out of road underneath it. If you're 60, recently single, sitting on money that finally feels like freedom rather than responsibility, I'd ask you this. Notice the feeling of being the most interesting man in the room. Notice it specifically and ask yourself honestly what's actually generating that feeling. If the answer is your personality, your humour, the man you've always been underneath the job title, that's worth protecting and enjoying properly. If the answer, if you're honest with yourself, is the bill you just picked up, that feeling will need feeding constantly at a rate no amount of money actually survives indefinitely, and the room will empty the moment you stop paying for it to stay full.